Okay. I forgot to record this, and I don't know why. I'm a little off kilter this week. This is a lot my grandson's last week of this is my grandson's last week of school, and he takes off for Florida next week. So we're kind of in flux here, but I'll try to get everything done. This is chapter two. This is the only chapter we're going to tackle in week two. It's chapter two in week two. Is that right? No, it's chapter three, isn't it? This is should be chapter three. Anyway, let's not worry about it. It's biopsychology. Psychological researchers study genetics in order to better understand the biological factors that contribute to certain behaviors. While all humans share certain biological mechanisms, we are each unique. And while our bodies have many of the same parts, brains and hormones, and cells with genetic codes, these are expressed in a wide variety of behaviors, thoughts, and reactions. Why do two people infected by the same disease have different outcomes? One surviving and one succumbing to the ailment. We saw this with COVID. A lot of people survived the disease, and some people who you would have thought wouldn't have succumbed did succumb. Well, one thing we discovered was that select individuals, people with type A blood, they overreact to diseases, and because they were overreacting, they had excessive more swelling in their lungs, and they had a more severe reaction than people with type O blood than people with type O blood. People with type B blood were somewhere in between the O's and the A's. How are genetic diseases passed through family lines? And we're going to talk about that in just a second. Are there genetic components to psychological disorders such as depression or schizophrenia? To what extent might there be a psychological basis to health conditions such as childhood obesity? My mother has brown eyes and my father has blue eyes. Brown eyes are dominant while blue eyes are recessive. Anytime a brown eyed gene is present, the offspring will have brown eyes. Blue eyed people have two recessive blue eyed genes, otherwise, they would have brown eyes. My first sister was born with blue eyes. My first brother had brown eyes. My second sister had brown eyes. I was number four with blue eyes. My second brother has brown eyes, and my baby brother has blue eyes. Is it? And so obviously it's possible for siblings, and these two individuals look very much alike, except one has blue eyes and the other has brown eyes. Why did half of my siblings have brown eyes and half of them had blue eyes? My father's sperm always carried the blue eyed trait because he was homozygous. Homo means the same. So both of his genes were blue eyed recessive homozygous genes. It was my mother who determined the eye color of the genes in her heterozygous or ova because hetero means other or different. So she had a brown eyed gene, a possibility of a brown-eyed gene and a possibility of a blue-eyed gene. If she had been homozygous brown, then all of her children would have had brown eyes. But obviously, that's not true. So she must have been heterozygous, blue-eyed and brown-eyed. Half of my mother's ova had dominant brown-eyed genes, and the other half had recessive blue genes. End product, three blue-eyed offspring and three brown-eyed offspring. Now, it didn't have to turn out that way. It was all determined by the gene that was in the ova of my mother. She could have had all brown-eyed children. She could have had all blue-eyed children. She could have had one blue-eyed child and five brown-eyed children. Uh, she could have had any combination of brown and blue. And that's the way it works. Now, I married a woman with brown eyes. I had babies with a woman with brown eyes, and both of my children have brown eyes, and I have blue eyes. Obviously, I have blue eyes. I just told you I had blue eyes, but so we don't know if the woman that I was reproducing with had heterozygous brown eyes or whether she had homozygous brown eyes. Now, both of my children have brown eyes, but it could have been that the blue-eyed trait just wasn't in the ova that became impregnated. If we had had 15 children, they could have all been brown-eyed children. If she was heterozygous or if she was homozygous. It's a toss-up. It's a 50-50 chance to get a brown-eyed child or a blue-eyed child. So let's talk about something more serious than eye color. Eye color doesn't really mean that much. Sickle cell anemia is a disease, and this is what a sickled cell looks like. The problem is that the round cells go through the blood vessels much more readily. These tend to get stuck, and when they get stuck in capillaries, then it causes swelling and it causes really serious problems. When a man and a woman with sickle cell trait have children, they have a 25% chance. When a woman and a man with sickle cell trait, that means that they don't have the disease, but they have a possibility of having offspring with it because they have the trait. So one of their genes is a non-sickle cell and the other one is a sickle cell. They don't have the disease because sickle cell anemia is recessive. Luckily, sickle cell anemia is recessive. So anytime they reproduce, if they reproduce with somebody who doesn't have the sickle cell trait, none of their children will have sickle cell anemia. And none of them, they can be born with the trait. Yes, they can be born with the trait. Because remember, 50% of the time, the individual with the trait is going to be giving the sickle cell trait as their gene, and the rest of the time, they're going to be giving a gene that doesn't have the sickle cell trait. Okay, so 50% of the time, they're going to be giving the trait, and the other time it's going to be nothing at all. So if we have two people with the sickle cell trait, that means 50% of the time, each one of them is going to be either giving away the sickle cell trait or giving away no trait at all. So mathematically, what happens is that one time out of four, they will have a child that has both of the traits, and which means that they're going to have sickle cell anemia. 50% of the time, half of the time, the individual will have the sickle cell trait, but they won't have sickle cell anemia. And one of the four children, will have no sickle cell trait at all. Now you think, well, that's great. That person doesn't have to worry about sickle cell anemia. They're right. They can reproduce with anybody. That is correct. But there is a reason why people in sub-Saharan Africa have the sickle cell trait, and that is because it seems to prevent malaria. People with sickle cell trait rarely get the severe forms of malaria, so they are protected if they have the trait. Of course, if they get sickle cell anemia, they die relatively young, but if they have the sickle cell trait, they won't get malaria. So the individual that's born without the trait, if they live in sub-Saharan Africa where malaria is prevalent, they are more likely to, if they don't have the trait, then they are more likely to have a severe form of malaria. So your choice is sickle cell anemia that will kill you, or malaria which will kill you, or you can have the trait. 8 to 10% of African Americans have sickle cell trait, while 0.3% have sickle cell anemia. Since there's very little malaria in the United States, the fact that they have sickle cell anemia isn't really important in the United States. It is important in sub-Saharan Africa, but not in the United States because we don't have malaria. Now, strangely, of course, and I guess this isn't that strange, but if we did have malaria in the United States, then all of the Europeans would be susceptible to the severe form of malaria. It is the African Americans that we're dealing with here. Genetic variation, the genetic difference between individuals, is what contributes to a species' adaptation to its environment. In humans, genetic variation begins with an egg, about 100 million sperm, and fertilization. It takes about 100 million sperm to actually fertilize an egg. Fertile women ovulate roughly once per month, releasing an egg from follicles in the ovary. During the egg's journey from the ovary through the fallopian tubes to the uterus, a sperm may fertilize the egg. The egg and the sperm each contain 23 chromosomes. Chromosomes are long strings of genetic material known as deoxyribonucleic acid, or better known as DNA. DNA is a helix-shaped molecule made up of nucleotide base pairs. In each chromosome, sequences of DNA make up genes that control or partially control a number of visible characteristics known as traits, such as eye color, hair color, and so on. And this is one of the reasons why, if you look at a family where a mother and father have reproduced a number of times, most of the children will have similar eye color and similar hair color. A single gene may have multiple possible variations or alleles. An allele is a specific version of a gene. So a given gene may code for the trait of hair color, and the different alleles of that gene affect which hair color an individual has. So it really all depends on the allele that is on that select chromosome. When a sperm and egg fuse, their 23 chromosomes combine to create a zygote with 46 chromosomes, 23 pairs. Therefore, each parent contributes half the genetic information carried by the offspring. The resulting physical characteristics of the offspring, called the phenotype, are determined by the interaction of genetic material supplied by the parents. Phenotype refers to the individual's genetic material that is expressed or shown, which can be influenced by the environment. So the phenotype is what we see. What we don't see is the genotype. That's the genetic material that it can be expressed, but it usually isn't. So this is the phenotype. The genotype is shown, and the genotype is the hidden information. Now this becomes extremely important when we're looking at transplanting somebody, or we're looking at blood types so that we can transfuse somebody. We're giving them blood from somebody else. If they have a genotype that will conflict with somebody's blood, then we need to determine what that genotype is. And that's one of the things that we do when we are cross-matching blood. What we're looking at, we can see the phenotype. The phenotype is AO, AB, or B, and with an RH, either RH positive or RH negative. But there are some genotypes out there. There are some unique forms of blood that would cause the blood to clot. And of course, you don't want that. You want to give somebody blood that will flow through their system without clotting. So what we're looking for is we're looking for a genotype anomaly. And there are genotype anomalies out there. When we're looking at transplanting somebody, we have to give them an organ from another individual. Or we're looking for an individual with exactly the same, not only phenotype, but also genotype, so that there won't be a conflict and they won't reject the organ. So phenotypes and genotypes are very important as far as blood transfusions and transplants are concerned. Gene mutations provide one source of harmful genes. A mutation is a sudden permanent change in a gene. While many mutations can be harmful or lethal, once in a while a mutation benefits an individual by giving that person an advantage over those who do not have the mutation. The theory of evolution asserts that individuals best adapted to their particular environments are more likely to reproduce and pass on their genes to future generations. A good example would be people that live around the Arctic Circle. If we look at these individuals, they tend to be fairly short and squat. In other words, they have short necks, they have short arms, and they have relatively short legs. And the reason is because if you're tall and slender, then it's really hard for you to maintain your body heat. An individual, the people that adapted best to that environment where it's extremely cold all the time are the people with short necks, short arms, and short legs. Each of us represents a unique interaction between our genetic makeup and our environment. This is known as the range of reaction and is one way to describe this interaction. Range of reaction asserts that our genes set the boundaries within which we can operate, and our environment interacts with the genes to determine where in that range we will fall. A good example is basketball. The people, if we look in the NBA, there's a lot more people that are over 7 feet tall than there are people that are below 6 feet tall. So the range of reaction for a good basketball player is somebody that is between 6 feet tall and 7 feet plus. Somebody below 6 feet tall, they are not probably not going to make the NBA. We can the number of people that have been in the NBA that have been that short in the last 50 years is minuscule, is very small. Another perspective on the interaction between genes and the environment is the concept of genetic environmental correlation. Our genes influence our environment, and our environment influences the expression of our genes. Not only do our genes and environment interact, as in range of reaction, but they also influence one another bidirectionally. A child of an NBA player who would probably be exposed to basketball from an early age. Such exposure might allow the child to realize his or her full genetic athletic potential. Thus, the parent's genes, which the child shares, influences the child's environment, and that environment in turn is well suited to support the child's genetic potential. And of course, we not only have NBA basketball players, but also Major League Baseball players, Ken Griffey and Ken Griffey Jr. We have Barry and Bobby Bonds, and this is Vlad Guerrero and Vlad Jr. And this, of course, is Stephen Curry and his dad. And I don't remember what his dad's first name is, but he was also a hot shooting point guard. In another approach to gene-environment interactions, the field of epigenetics looks beyond the genotype itself and studies how the same genotype can be expressed in different ways. Researchers study how the same genotype can lead to very different phenotypes. Genes affect more than our physical characteristics. Scientists have found genetic linkages to a number of behavioral characteristics, ranging from basic personality traits to sexual orientation to spirituality. Genes are also associated with temperament and a number of psychological disorders such as depression and schizophrenia. While it is true that genes provide the biological blueprints for our cells, tissues, organs, and body, they also have a significant impact on our experiences and our behaviors. In 2004, in a 2004 study by Finnish psychologist Pekka Tieneri and colleagues of people who were given up for adoption, adoptees whose biological mothers had schizophrenia and who had been raised in a disturbed family environment were much more likely to develop schizophrenia or another psychotic disorder than were any of the other groups in the study. Of adoptees whose biological mothers had schizophrenia, a high genetic risk, and who were raised in disturbed family environments, 36.8% were likely to develop schizophrenia. Of adoptees whose biological mothers had schizophrenia, a high genetic risk, of course, and who were raised in healthy family environments, only 5.8% were likely to develop schizophrenia. This is a longitudinal study done in Finland. Of adoptees with a low genetic risk whose mothers did not have schizophrenia and who were raised in disturbed family environments, 5.3% were likely to develop schizophrenia. don't know why I have. Shut up. Okay. Of adoptees with a low risk, a low genetic risk, whose mothers did not have schizophrenia and who were raised in healthy family environments, 4.8% were likely to develop schizophrenia. So that's the best way to do it, I guess. Biological psychologists seek biological evidence for psychological phenomena. They study how mental processes and behavior are linked to biological structures and processes. They concentrate on such structures as the neurons, the nervous system in general, the cerebral cortex, the endocrine system, and heredity. And of course, the cerebral cortex is the outer covering of your brain. The main structure of the nervous system is the nerve cells or neurons. All our functions, sensations, and perceptions are controlled by neurons. We are born with 100 billion neurons. Most of these are in our brains. Neurons communicate through an electrochemical process triggered by a chemical known as a neurotransmitter. This is important. This is important that neurotransmitters are chemicals. The reason they're important is because we can use pharmaceuticals to control them, or to change them, or to block them. And this is one of the ways that we can control mental illness, is by blocking select neurotransmitters. The neurotransmitter passes from one neuron to the other through a narrow gap called the synapse. And this is the synapse right here. This is the area, the open area between two neurons. The neurotransmitter that triggers an electrical imbalance in the receiving neuron that causes the neuron to discharge its own neurotransmitter at the other end of the cell. So it creates an electrical imbalance, but it is a chemical, and it is, of course, the chemical that creates the problem, or it's the chemical that changes what happens. The brain and the body not only contain neurons, but a large number of glial cells as well. Glial cells are the housekeeping cells of the neurons, nourishing them, protecting them, and directing their growth. The neuron receives information from tentacle-like structures known as dendrites. As a living cell, the neuron must maintain a nucleus, which is located in its cell body called a soma. The neuron transmits its message through its main stalk, a structure called the axon. So this is the soma. These are the dendrites right here. This is the axon, and these are more dendrites, and those are these are the ones that are giving the message to another area. So a muscle or another neuron. These are the dendrites that accept the information. This is the soma. This is the cell body. Anytime you hear soma, it has to do with body. And this is the axon. This is where the reaction has to take place to send the information down to the synaptic cleft. In this case, of course, we're talking about dendrites. At the end of the axon is a bulbous structure known as the terminal. Messages that are collected by the dendrites pass through the soma and into the axon for transmission into the next neuron or muscle. At the end of the terminal is the synaptic cleft, and we've already talked about that portion right there. Some axons are wrapped in a fatty sheath called a myelin. The myelin is actually constructed of specialized glial cells called Schwann cells. The myelin is segmented into sausage-like structures with the openings between the segments called the nodes of Ranvier. Myelin insulates the axon from the electrical charged atmosphere from the neuron. Myelin accelerates the response 110 times and looks white as compared to gray matter. So if we look at the brain, the outer covering of the brain is gray matter. We talk about, you probably heard this before, the gray matter in your brain. The gray matter is actually the thinking portion of your brain. But if we look at the spinal column, of course, the spinal column needs to react very quickly, and it is white material, white matter that is around gray matter. So the white matter, of course, needs to react very quickly. Our thinking process doesn't need to be that rapid. Therefore, it is gray matter. Underneath the gray matter is white matter, as interesting as that is. A disease of the myelin is multiple sclerosis. In this disease, the fatty myelin is replaced with fibrous tissue that interrupts impulses and makes it difficult to function. Eventually, MS sufferers lose their mobility due to non-functional motor nerves in the legs and back. The sufferer will be able to maintain functioning until the nerve damage becomes severe enough to destroy the nerve. And this is what a normal nerve looks like, and this is what one looks like if the person is suffering from multiple sclerosis. When a stimulus comes into the body, it travels to the central nervous system, the brain, and the spinal cord through afferent neurons. When the central nervous system sends out a response, it travels through efferent neurons. Afferent neurons, nerves carry sensory information from sense organs through the central nervous system. Efferent neurons carry information away from the central nervous system to the muscles and the glands. So if I smash my finger, the information that I've just smashed my finger travels up afferent neurons into my spinal column and my brain. The central nervous system will send back a message, pull your hand back, stupid, and through efferent neurons. And it will probably go right from the spinal column. It'll hit the spinal column, and then it will send back a message, move your stupid hand, you big dummy, which is what I will do. Neural impulses are electrochemical impulses. At rest, the electrical charge inside a neuron is at minus 70 millivolts. The charge is negative because of the increased amount of negative chloride ions. Also inside the neuron are positively charged potassium ions. Outside the cell are positively charged sodium ions. Wow, wait a minute. Sodium, we have sodium, and we have chloride. That is salt. We also have potassium chloride. That's salt too. So it's very important to maintain a level of salt in your system. Otherwise, your body wouldn't be able to react. So salt water or salt, and if you taste, well, if you cut yourself open and you tasted your blood, it would taste salty. Or if you tasted the fluid that comes, that oozes out of a wound, it would be salty as well. Just about everything in your system is salty because it needs to be salty in order for a proper reaction to take place. When a chemical neurotransmitter signals a need for a response, it changes the permeability of the membrane of the cell. Sodium gates and potassium gates open, and some potassium rushes out and lots of sodium rushes in. This area becomes depolarized and starts a chain reaction up the neuron. And that's one of the reasons why your neuron reacts. It reacts because of this electrical charge that runs down the axon. So much sodium rushes into the negative negative 70 millivolts converts to positive 40 millivolts. The change of 110 millivolts is the neuron's action potential. So it goes from minus 70 to positive 40. And if we add those two together, it means that the change is 110 millivolts. As soon as it fires, the neuron starts recovering by dumping sodium and picking up potassium. Sodium ions are larger than potassium ions. So sodium, the sodium gates have to open up and for sodium to get through. The potassium ions are about half the size of a sodium ion, and it can neutralize itself. Then the the sodium gate has to open up. If the sodium gate closes, sodium can't get in. But the potassium still can get in because it's half the size of the sodium ion. Neurons only fire completely in what is known as the all or none principle. When an axon communicates at a synapse with its partner, it sends a flood of neurotransmitter across the synaptic cleft to excite the next neuron. More neurotransmitter than is necessary is sent across the cleft To stop the response process, the neuron reabsorbs the neurotransmitter in the cleft and select reuptake sites. And this is why when we talk about serotonin, and we're trying to increase the amount of serotonin in your synaptic cleft so that you won't be as depressed. We talk about selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. In other words, it inhibits the reuptake of serotonin, allowing the serotonin to stay in the synaptic cleft longer. This will, the excess serotonin will allow the individual to be happier because serotonin makes you happy. So if we can do that, if we can use a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, we can actually make people happier, or we can repair, we can take care of their depression with selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. Acetylcholine causes muscle contractions. It also has to do with memory. It is involved with the hippocampus to create long-term memory. The death of acetylcholine-producing cells in the brain adds to the rapid memory loss in Alzheimer's disease. And it is because of these acetylcholine-producing cells dying that the person's memory goes. And then eventually, of course, it's a fairly rapid decline, and this is known as Alzheimer's disease because the acetylcholine producing cells are dying. Norepinephrine, or also known as noradrenaline, accelerates heart rate along with other processes. It leads to general arousal. It helps learning and memory. It tells you to eat. Norepinephrine causes the manic and manic depression. Cocaine and amphetamines cause the release and block the reuptake of norepinephrine, and that's why you are so manic when you are when you take your speed, cocaine, your stimulants, cocaine and amphetamines. Dopamine is involved in fine muscle movement. It also is involved in learning and memory. It's involved in emotional arousal. Schizophrenia seems to have something to do with too many dopamine receptor sites in the brain. This causes delusions and hallucinations. A deficiency of dopamine causes Parkinson's disease. Parkinson's disease is where you have palsy, you have tremors, and jerky muscle movements. So too much dopamine in the brain causes schizophrenia. Too little dopamine in the brain causes Parkinson's disease. Serotonin is involved in emotional arousal and sleep. Deficiency of serotonin are implicated in depression, overeating, aggression, and alcoholism and insomnia. It is serotonin that acts as the inhibitory neurotransmitter to control the aggression caused by testosterone in the hypothalamus. The mood-enhancing Prozac, Zoloft, and Paxil are all known as selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. LSD works because it inhibits serotonin, and thus it causes excitation. Endorphins inhibit pain, takes up the receptor site for the neurotransmitters that cause the pain response, prostaglandins, substance P, and bradykinin. Those are the three chemicals in your body that tell you that you're in pain. Endorphins take up the same receptor sites as those chemicals do, and since it blocks it, since it has taken it up, it blocks the substance P, bradykinin, and prostaglandins from being from exciting your brain and telling you that you're in pain. Endorphins are the cause of runner's high. Endorphins can also give us a sense of competence. The peripheral nervous system is comprised of all neurons not accounted for by the central nervous system. They are all connected to the central nervous system. One part of the peripheral nervous system is the somatic nervous system. It connects the skeletal muscles, the sensory receptors, and the surface of the body with the central nervous system. The autonomic or automatic nervous system is also part of the peripheral nervous system. It regulates things that have to take place without or our thinking and about it, like your heartbeat, your digestion, your respiration, and dilation of your pupils. If you had to think about it, of course, then you would have to think, I need to digest my food. I need to digest my food. Wait a minute, I forgot to make my heart beat. So this all has to happen automatically. Two branches of the autonomic nervous system are the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. The sympathetic nervous system responds to stress, causing the body to ready itself for fighting or fleeing. It increases your heart rate, causes a surge of sugar in your body. It shuts down your digestion and stops your kidney function. The parasympathetic nervous system restores normal function after the sympathetic nervous system has caused body changes. The spinal cord acts as an information conduit to the brain. However, some stimuli only go to the spinal column before they are responded to. These are called spinal reflexes, the knee-jerk response, bladder and defecating responses, as well as your sexual responses. And for this reason, if an individual is paralyzed from the neck down, they can still have sexual responses because these responses will go they don't have to get into the brain. They don't have to go through the brain. So if you're paralyzed from the neck down, you can still have sexual responses. In this case, the stimulus runs the afferent neuron to the neurons to the neuron called the interneuron, and then back through the efferent neurons. So it doesn't have to go into the brain. Most responses do go to the brain, but the spinal reflexes do not. If you look at a cross-section of the spinal cord, you will see that it is mostly an outer layer of white matter surrounding a core of gray matter. The gray matter is slower, non-myelinated cells, and the white matter is myelinated cells. The brain has an outer layer of gray matter and an inner layer of white, as you can see from this MRI. The human brain is much larger than any other animal save the African elephant-nosed fish. As odd as that is, there's a fish out there with a bigger brain than humans have. Because males are larger than most females, their brains are about 15% larger than most females' brains. Even accounting for the size difference, the male brain is still about 5% larger than the female brain. But brain size has little to do with intelligence, oddly enough. And there are several cerebral aspects that favor women. Female brains seem to utilize more glucose than male brains. Female brains have a larger corpus callosum, the connection between the two hemispheres. As a matter of fact, the female corpus callosum is about 11% larger than the male corpus callosum. In the 1850s, renowned French surgeon Paul Broca decided that some people were naturally smarter than other people because of their race. He figured that the individuals with the largest brain would be the smartest person. He discovered that looking at hundreds of skulls from the ancients and modern races, that Eskimos had the largest brains. These are the people that they used to call Eskimos. Now we refer to them as Inuits and Aleuts, the individuals that live in the cold regions, in the Arctic regions of the north. He next looked at forearm and upper arm ratios. The apes have long forearms and short upper arms, and discovered that Eskimos once again had the smallest ratio of all the races that he surveyed, which told him that Eskimos were the smartest people on Earth. But of course, as we know, size doesn't matter in this case, and the ratio, of course, doesn't have anything to do with intelligence. Broca began a scientific endeavor where he weighed men of letters' brains after they died to see how much difference there was between individuals. Broca was convinced that Frenchmen were smarter than Germans, and this is what he was trying to support. There was also this idea that different races of some people were not real bright, and other people were extremely intelligent. And of course, he was trying to prove that white people were smarter than any other race. So as strangely, he decided that he was going to weigh people's brains. He had already measured their skulls and found out that Eskimos, of course, had the biggest brains. Now he decided that he would weigh their brains to find out who was the most intelligent. So all these intelligent men, these men of letters, they were all donating their brains to the endeavor. They of course discovered that some brilliant men had fairly light brains. Intelligence has nothing to do with size, but the number of synapses that you have developed in your brain, something represented by fissures and convolutions, also known as sulci. I'm sorry. Okay. Modern humans have brains that average about 1,500 grams. Ivan Turgenev, and this is Ivan Turgenev right here, had a brain of more than 2,000 grams. Anatole France had a brain of less than 1,000 grams. This is a Neanderthal man. The average Neanderthal brain weighed about 1,750 grams. So Neanderthals actually had bigger brains than modern humans, as strange as that is. So why in the world didn't they survive? We don't know. Some parts of the brain are prominent in lower animals, and these parts are the ones that scientists call the primitive brain. And this is the primitive brain right here. Cerebellum, there's the this is the cerebellum right here. And this is the brain stem. And this is known as the primitive brain. This is known as the hindbrain and consists of the medulla pons and the cerebellum. Coming off the spinal column, a cord is a flaring of the cord mass that is the first part of the brain. This is known as the medulla. This is the medulla right here. The medulla regulates your heartbeat, your blood pressure, and your respiration. It is also crucial in sleeping, sneezing, and coughing. Strangely enough, your skull hits right about here. So if you're riding on a motorcycle and you fall off, your head, of course, is heavier than your neck, and your neck has a difficult time supporting it. Your neck will hyperextend, and if you hit the ground at that point, then your skull will cut into this portion of your brain, causing you to go into a coma. And if it cuts this part, then we've got a really serious problem, because this is the part that controls your heartbeat, your blood pressure, and your respiration. So now you can't breathe, your heart stops beating, and of course your blood pressure crashes, and you will probably not survive. The pons is a rounded bulge in the front of the medulla. The pons acts as a bridge between the spinal cord and the brain. It relays information about body movement and relates to attention, sleep, and alertness. The cerebellum is a small sphere that lies behind the pons and the medulla. The cerebellum controls balance and muscle coordination. Injury to the cerebellum will cause loss of coordination and a problem maintaining muscle tone. It is a cerebellum that is anesthetized when someone is so drunk that they are having trouble walking. As it turns out, when you drink, you anesthetize your brain from this portion, which is your reasoning portion of your brain, all the way back to your cerebellum. And if your cerebellum gets anesthetized, like the front part of your brain is, or the rest of your brain has been anesthetized, you black out. You can't maintain yourself anymore. The reticular activating system is a structure that runs from the hindbrain into the rest of the parts of the brain. The reticular activating system acts as an alarm clock of sorts. When something happens while you are asleep that you need to wake up for, it's the RAS that can arouse you out of deep sleep. Damage to or pressure on the RAS will put an individual into a coma. It is the RAS in this area, as you can see, it runs all the way from your medulla up in through your pons. This is the portion that actually puts you into the coma. If there's swelling in the area, of course, can keep you in the coma. That swelling has to go down before you can come out of your coma. And this is one of the reasons why people stay in a coma for an extended length of time, or can stay in a coma for an extended length of time. It's because this area is swelled up and it's pressing on that RAS, and the RAS is telling the person to stay asleep. The forebrain consists of the thalamus, the hypothalamus, the limbic system, and the cerebellum. The thalamus is located in the middle of the brain. This is the thalamus right here. It's relatively large. The thalamus relays sensory information to the sensory areas of the brain. It also helps control sleep and attention to muscle coordination. That is your thalamus. It is a relaying area. It relays information from the primitive portion of your brain into your cerebrum. The hypothalamus lies under the thalamus and above the pituitary gland. The hypothalamus regulates body temperature, concentration of fluids, storage of nutrients, and deals in motivation and emotion. It is involved in your hunger drive, your thirst, your sexual behavior, caring for offspring, aggression, and it is part of the pleasure center. The limbic system is a group of structures that are involved in memory, motivation, and emotion. Amygdala is an almond-shaped structure that controls aggression. This is your amygdala right here. From research, we know that one part makes us aggressive and one part makes us docile, potentially having something to do with the fight or flight response. The hippocampus is involved in memory formation and retrieval, and this is the hippocampus right here. The cerebrum is that part of the brain that represents our intellectual powers. The outer portion is known as the cerebral cortex. It is primarily gray matter. The wrinkles are known as convolutions, and the valleys are known as fissures. And that's what the brain looks like. This is a very smart person. You can see all the fissures and convolutions in this brain. The cerebrum has two halves, the right and the left. The two halves are connected by the corpus callosum. The cortex is only about 1/8 of an inch thick. The cerebral cortex. This is your thinking portion of your brain. This is where all of your thought processes take place in your cortex, and it's only 1/8 of an inch thick. There are 4 lobes of the brain. The frontal in front, where most of our intellectual thought takes place. This is your frontal lobe here. The parietal lobe is behind the frontal lobe and controls touch and movement sensations to most of the body. Occipital lobe is in the back. It is our visual center, and our temporal lobe, right in front of our ears, is in the temple area, and of course it controls your hearing. The sensory motor cortex is in the parietal lobe, just behind the central fissure. It is where warm, cold, touch, pain, and movement for most of the body is detected. The motor cortex lies in front of the central fissure in the frontal lobe. It controls motor responses. Learning, language, and speech are very complex responses that require stimulation in many areas of the brain. Women tend to have better language skills than men, and some evolutionary psychologists feel that it is because women have a larger corpus callosum that allows more communication between the hemispheres. Damage to certain portions of the brain can cause curious language difficulties. Wernicke's area is in the temporal lobe. This is the Wernicke's area right here, this purple spot. It responds to auditory information. When you read something, it will travel from the occipital lobe, be recorded as auditory information, and then be transferred back to Wernicke's area for interpretation. That is why when you read, you sometimes feel as if you can hear what you are reading. Damage to Wernicke's area causes a condition known as Wernicke's aphasia. where the individual has a difficult time understanding spoken language. And this is one of the reasons when you get a blow to your head, one of the things we're going to do is hold up a number of fingers and ask you, how many fingers am I holding up? The reason we're saying that to you is because we need to find out if the back portion of your brain, the occipital lobe is damaged or has a concussion, or if there's something going on back there. If you can hear, if you can see and identify how many fingers we're holding up, of course, you're also hearing what we're saying, and you're going to respond to what we're saying. Just because we're holding three fingers up, you're not going to say three. We want you to talk as well, and the reason is because we need to know if there is damage to your Wernicke's area. So we want you to understand spoken language. We need you to speak to us so that we can tell if you have some kind of a concussion. Sometimes after a concussion to the side of the head, it will take the person several minutes before they can understand what is being said to them, and that's one of the reasons why we do this. Broca's area is located in the frontal lobe on the side of the left hemisphere. It controls those muscles that are used during speaking. Damage to the area causes a condition known as Broca's aphasia, which is characterized by slow, laborious speech. A concussion to this part of the brain will cause slurred speech, and we want you to talk to us. That's why we're asking you how many fingers we're holding up. We want you to be able to see. We want you to be able to hear. We want you to be able to speak. The other thing that we will do is ask you a question like, what day is today? We want to know if the reasoning portion of your brain is functioning as well, or if there has been damage to that portion of your brain. The angular gyrus lies between the visual cortex and the Wernicke's area. It interprets visual cues and translates them into auditory information. Dyslexia is caused by a malfunction in the angular gyrus, making it difficult for individuals to break written words into sounds. 8 to 10% of people are left-handed. More boys are left-handed than girls. Left-handed people are more likely to have learning disabilities. They're more likely to have migraine headaches. They're more likely to be artists. They're more likely to be musicians. They're more likely to be mathematicians. Some children with epilepsy, which is uncontrollable electrical activity in the brain that causes seizures, have to have the affected hemisphere of the brain removed. In these cases, they actually develop normally with just half a brain, having trouble with just select motor movements, but they are just as intellectually astute as they would be if they had a whole brain. There are two kinds of glands with ducts leading directly to the affected organ, such as your salivary glands and your sweat glands, and glands that are called ductless, that dump their affecting substance, in this case hormones, into the bloodstream to affect another organ, gland or organ in another part of your body. And these are known, the ductless glands are known as endocrine glands. Endocrine glands function by what is called a negative feedback loop. The gland is signaled to release the hormone, and the on switch stays on until it is signaled to stop, kind of like a gas pump that shuts off automatically when the gasoline touches the nozzle. It has an off switch, and it tells it to turn it off. If it doesn't, of course, then you spill gasoline all over the gas station. In the old days, the pituitary gland was considered the master gland, but now we understand that the hypothalamus actually tells the pituitary gland when to control the rest of the endocrine glands. Most of these hormones are called releasing hormones, so the hypothalamus produces releasing hormones that tells the pituitary gland to signal the release of these different hormones. The hypothalamus is in the middle of the brain. The pituitary gland lies right below it and is about the size of a pea. The pituitary gland produces human growth hormone, which regulates the growth of humans. Too much causes gigantism. Too little produces midgetism. Dwarfism is a genetic flaw that retards the growth of the long bones and doesn't have anything to do with the pituitary gland. This is the tallest individual living today. He lives in China, and he is suffering from gigantism. This is a normal-sized woman. This is a normal-sized person, and this is what he looks like. This is the tallest man that has ever existed. He was 8 feet 11 and a half inches tall. He's almost 9 feet tall. His name was Robert Wadlow. His size kind of messed him up. And it messed him up because he had a hard time, his body had a hard time communicating with itself. He had circulation problems. He had feet that were size 23, which is really, really big. This is his mother right here. It was a pituitary problem. These are normal-sized men. He was almost 9 feet tall. He was almost so tall that his head, well, he was a foot short of the basketball goal. Basketball goals are 10 feet high. His head would have come within a foot of the basketball goal. He died at age 23 from a blood infection in his feet. His feet got infected. He wore blisters on his feet. They became infected, and he was dead within 2 days. This is his brother, by the way. Prolactin is produced by the pituitary gland. Prolactin stimulates milk production in women. Antidiuretic hormone comes from the pituitary gland as well. It regulates fluid levels in the body to keep the individual from becoming dehydrated. Oxytocin is also a pituitary hormone. It stimulates labor in pregnant women. In some animals, oxytocin brings about cuddling and caring for their young. In humans, when the nipple area is stimulated in a lactating woman, it stimulates the brain to produce oxytocin, which causes the breasts to eject milk so the baby has something to eat. Melatonin is secreted by the pineal gland. The pineal gland is directly behind the pituitary gland. Melatonin helps regulate the sleep cycle. It may also have something to do with puberty and aging, but we're not exactly sure what. I have always been really interested in staying young for an extended length of time. I'm 71 years old right now. Back in the 70s, they were telling people that they needed to take melatonin in order to stay young. It was a theory. I never tried it. Melatonin also makes you feel sleepy. So I don't have any problems with my sleep cycle. So I didn't really try that. Thyroxin, or T4, is secreted by the thyroid gland. Thyroxin regulates the body's metabolism. Metabolism is the body's regulation of the utilization of oxygen and production of energy. And that's what T4 does. Hypothyroidism means low thyroxin production. This leads to lethargy, depressive symptoms, and weight gain. When this occurs in a newborn, it can cause stunted growth and permanent mental deficits. This is a condition known as cretinism, where the baby is born with hypothyroidism. Hyperthyroidism means high thyroxin production. This leads to manic behavior, insomnia, brittle hair, bulging eyes, and weight loss. The thyroid is regulated by thyroid stimulating hormone, or TSH, which comes from the pituitary gland. Corticosteroids are hormones produced in the adrenal cortex. The adrenal glands are located on top of each kidney, and the cortex is the outer layer. Corticosteroids are secreted when the individual is in a stressful situation. They promote muscle growth and cause the liver to release stored sugar. The adrenal cortex is regulated through the release of adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH, which is released by the pituitary gland. The adrenal medulla is the inner area of the adrenal gland. Adrenaline and noradrenaline also known as epinephrine and norepinephrine, are secreted by the adrenal medulla. Both hormones are released to help the individual deal with stress. Research has shown that adrenaline intensifies emotions. It seems to especially work on fear and anxiety. Noradrenaline raises blood pressure. The sexual glands of the individual, the testes of the male, and the ovaries of the woman produce testosterone. The ovaries and testes are actually the same structure during early development. With males, the embryo is bathed in either increasing levels of testosterone to cause them to develop male characteristics. Males, the embryo, okay. Yeah, okay. Well, anyway. When males are born, they will develop primary sexual characteristics. These characteristics will develop further with puberty and will be directly involved in reproduction, penis growth, and sperm growth. Males will develop secondary sexual characteristics that don't have anything to do with reproduction, but help males attract females. The thickening of the chest and shoulder muscles, male pattern hair growth, enlargement of the voice box to create the Adam's apple, and to deepen the voice, and growing to an adult height. Synthetic testosterone, called anabolic steroids, is sometimes taken to increase muscle mass, increase resistance to stress, and overcharge the energy supply. The problem is that steroids cause liver damage, weaken the immune system, sometimes cause uncontrollable rage, and lead to kidney failure. And of course, it's always nice to have a liver that functions and kidneys that function. You can't live without your kidneys and your liver. Testosterone is also found in women, but its production is much less. It assists in the female's sex drive. Estrogen is produced in large amounts by women in the ovaries and in small amounts by men in the testes. Along with progesterone, it regulates the menstrual cycle. It is increased in the amount of estrogen. It is an increase in the amount of estrogen being produced that triggers menarche, or the first menstrual period. It triggers secondary sexual characteristics in women, which includes ovulation and the accumulation of fat in the breasts and the hips. Secondary sexual characteristics for women include a growth spurt and pubic hair growth. Estrogen has amazing powers of protection for women. Estrogen is high during the ovulatory years. It thins the blood, making women less likely to have heart attacks and strokes. It protects women from kidney stones. It acts as an antioxidant and so protects women from some cancers. It may protect women from Alzheimer's disease. Estrogen seems to have a psychological effect on women. During peak times, women tend to be more positive. When estrogen is low, women are likely to be moody, are more likely to be moody. When estrogen levels are the highest during ovulation, women are more interested in sexual activity than when they aren't fertile. Studies have shown that women are more attracted to men who have strong masculine features during ovulation, but are more attracted to men with more feminized features at other times. And this is, of course, is the same individual. This is the individual with more masculinized features, and this is the individual with more feminized features. Progesterone works in tandem with estrogen to regulate the menstrual cycle. Progesterone's main function is to maintain the uterus and provide for pregnancy. An increase in progesterone causes the sexual organs to mature. And that is the end of the chapter. So there you go. That is it. I apologize for this being late.